So this begins part 3 of our lecture series on Islam and Islamic empires. So if you remember the last 2 parts, we talked about the rise of Islam, the basic beliefs of Islam, and then in part 2 we talked about the Abbasid dynasty and its decline. So in part 3 we're going to talk about the rise of the Turkish empires. So as the Abbasid Empire is declining, we're going to get a group of people called Turks. It's an ethnic group from Central Asia, and they had already converted to Islam, and they're going to come in and they're going to create 2 new Islamic empires, one after the other. The first of these Turkish Islamic empires is the Seljuk Empire, and then following them will be the Ottoman Empire. So let's talk about where these people came from. So the Seljuk Turks are from, like I said, from Central Asia. And so if we look on this map, it's right here, kind of Western Central Asia, and they had already converted to Islam, as we had said last time, through trade and conquest with the Abbasids. So the first Turks to enter the Abbasid Empire are going to be coming in as slaves. So the Abbasids are going to raid into Turkish areas and are going to bring back Turkish boys as slaves. And then the Caliph, or the emperor, is going to use these boys as slaves for his army. And so he's going to raise them, he's going to convert them to Islam if they haven't been converted already, and then they are going to be very loyal troops to him because ever since a very young age, probably about 5 or so, they have seen the emperor not as an enslaver, but as somebody who's fed them and housed them and clothed them and trained them and given them status and a position. And so they're very loyal to this Caliph, this Abbasid ruler, because he gave them everything they have. And so these warriors that were these slave warriors were called Mamluks. All right, now as time goes on, the Abbasids start to weaken. We've talked about reasons why. And these Mamluks, they start to get more and more influence. These warrior slaves start to get more and more influence in the Abbasid court. And so they're getting more and more power. In addition to that, not only are the Mamluks getting more and more power, but then we see new waves of Turks come in, and they're called Seljuk Turks, and they're going to come in and start conquering parts of the Abbasid Empire that are falling apart, that are splintering off from the Abbasid state. Eventually, they will just completely take over the Abbasid Empire, and they will replace it as the Seljuk Turks, or the Seljuk Empire. So, once the Seljuk Muslims are in charge of Southwest Asia, what do? Well, they don't want to change much, because if you're a conquering empire, if you start changing how the empire is governed, that's going to tick off the people. Change scares people, and so they're going to start rebelling. And so it's best if you can take over an empire to continue the practices of the previous empire as far as administration, because it's familiar and people won't want to rebel. And so they continue using the jizya. So all of the Damini, or the people of the book, the Christians and Jews that live in their empire, they say you can continue to stay being Christian, no reason to rebel, as long as you pay the religious tax, the jizya, and that they just continue that from what the Abbasids did. Next, they're going to continue to promote trade. They're going to continue to build caravanserai, just like the Abbasids did, because trade brings wealth into the empire, and you can tax that wealth, and then you have a bigger army or bigger palaces and those kinds of things. And of course, they're going to continue to use Islamic law or Sharia law. Most of the people in their empire are Muslim, and so they're used to having the Quran as the law, Sharia, so they're just going to continue that. So we see quite a bit of continuity here. They are, however, going to make some changes. And so if you're a Jewish person or a Christian in the Seljuk Empire, you're still allowed to be Jewish or Christian as long as you pay the jizya. But now we're going to start clamping down on it a little bit. And so they might start to pass laws that say, okay, if you're a Christian, pay the jizya, but you cannot go out and proselytize, right? You cannot go out into the street and try to convert people to Christianity. We're an Islamic state. We're okay with you being Christian, but not Christianity growing. Or they sometimes would say, okay, you can have your church, but you can't repair it. And so over time, we see that the numbers of Christians will shrink, or Jews will shrink, because who wants to go worship in a church that's got holes in the ceiling, and you can't go get new members. And so over time, we see the Christian and Jewish populations of Southwest Asia start to shrink and shrink and shrink. And so that is the Seljuks. We'll talk a little bit more about them in and so forth. But now let's go ahead and move on to another wave of Turks that come in, and they're the Ottoman Turks. So this is later in history, and again, this area right up here, this is where the Turks live. And this time, a little bit later in history, they're gonna be attacked by these big Mongol armies, and we're going to talk about the Mongols later on in the unit. And as the Mongol armies are expanding west, they're going to run into the Turks. Now the Turks do not want to die because the Mongols are unstoppable, and so the Turks run in to the Seljuk Empire, and they start settling in this region, and a lot of them will settle in what is today modern-day Turkey, which just gets its name from the Turks. And so we have a new wave of Turks, ethnic Turks moving in, already Muslim, but they're just different than the Seljuks. They're just kind of a different subgroup than the Seljuks. They're the Ottoman Turks. So the Ottomans are going to rise to power, as we said, to escape Mongolian invasions. And so as they come in, they will start to settle all throughout the Seljuk Turkish Empire. But for the most part, we're going to talk about the Ottoman Turks that settle right here in this little area. And they're going to establish an independent state within the Seljuk Turkish Empire, bordering what is known as the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire is right here, and that's a Christian empire. It's an Orthodox Christian empire. And for a long time, they have been fighting either the Umayyads or the Abbasids or the Seljuks. They are the Christian empire in southeastern Europe that is trying to stop the expansion of Islam into that region. And so the next group of Muslims that the Byzantines are going to face are the Ottoman Turks. So as the Mongols come in and start to disrupt things in the Seljuk Empire and what is left of the Abbasid Empire, we're going to see lots of chaos and anarchy. And in that kind of climate, we can see that this small group of Ottoman Turks are able to expand their rule, to take advantage of this power vacuum, this chaos, and start to expand out. And as you can see in the map, right, the brown area is where the Ottoman Turks are first settling and then starting to expand. And over time, they just add more territory, and keep going. Now, their original leader that is going to unite all of these Ottoman Turks into one kind of cohesive group is Osman. And we can see him right here, and that's where the term Ottoman comes from, the Osman Turks. And so there he is, and he is going to be kind of the founding leader of this empire. So what is going to drive this empire to go and conquer? Well, one, just like many Muslim states in this time period, they're driven by religion. They believe that it is their mission to go and spread the influence of Islam, spread the religion, spread their culture. And so we call these warriors Ghazi. And so here we see these Ottoman Turks, they're known as Ghazi, and they're warriors for Islam. They're going to try to put more and more territory under Islamic control. And this is going to inspire them to go fight more because they're doing it for Allah. So that brings them into contact with, I said, the Byzantine Empire, the Christian empire that is in southeastern Europe. And these two empires will fight tooth and nail for many years until eventually the Ottomans are going to conquer the Byzantine Empire. So we'll talk about that in just a second. And so as the Ottomans are expanding, not only do they have land conquest, but they're also going to, of course, try to go out into the sea and conquer, because the Mediterranean is a trade area. It is a sea lane, and everybody wants to control trade areas, whether they're overland trade areas or sea trade areas. If you control the trade, you can tax the trade, like I said, and that brings in wealth to the empire. And so the Ottomans start building up a navy. They haven't never had one before, but they start doing that. Now, the Ottomans are going to hear about gunpowder weapons. And so gunpowder is invented in China, but over the Silk Roads and through Indian Ocean trade, the idea of gunpowder is going to make its way to the Islamic world. And so they're going to start to use these gunpowder weapons in their conquest. And in 1453, they finally finish off the Byzantine Empire. And so if you remember, the Byzantine Empire was right here. And as the Ottomans are expanding, they're rubbing up against the Byzantines. And eventually, the city of Constantinople, which is right here, it's at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, which made it a great trade location. The Ottomans are going to eventually take it in 1453. And that is a date to know. That's one of the specific dates you need to know, because that's kind of a turning point in world history. And so the Byzantine Empire finally falls. It's been around for like 1,000 years, just about. And so we see that it falls, and now it is an Islamic city and an Islamic state. And so the capital of the Byzantine Empire was called Constantinople. So when the Muslims take it over, they're going to rename Constantinople, and they're going to call it Istanbul, which is right here. And that's going to become the capital of the Ottoman world at this time. So how do the Ottomans administer their empire? So we had talked about how the Abbasids divided their empire up into provinces and put local people called emirs in charge who were local leaders, and as long as they were Muslim, they could rule. Well, the Seljuks are going to do much the same thing, and so are the Ottomans, so we see a continuity here. And so as the Ottomans conquer, they put locals in charge as long as they're Muslim, but at the very top, we have the Sultan. Now, in previous empires, we called the Caliph, the head guy in charge who's a Muslim, who's responsible for spreading Islam, but also he's responsible for the state, for the governance of the state. And so here we see we're not going to call him the Caliph anymore, we're going to call him the Sultan. And in theory, he has absolute power. What he says is the law. What he says has to happen. Now, he has, according to Islam, he can have 4 wives, and he does, but there's no limit to the amount of concubines he can have. Women that are somewhere between girlfriend and wife. They're official girlfriends, if you will. And so these concubines could number in the 1, 2, 3, 400s. And so he has this large group of wives and concubines known as a harem. And this is going to occupy a lot of his time, as you can imagine. And so he's going to have hundreds of kids and hundreds of sons. And we have talked about how that led to a decline of the Abbasid Empire, and we're going to talk about that later on. Eventually, this system of having so many sons is going to lead to the Ottoman decline, but we're a long ways away from that. And so now, the Ottoman Sultan is going to spend a lot of his time living in his palaces, enjoying his life, visiting his harem, and so he doesn't really have time to run the government. And so he's going to take a right-hand man called the vizier, and he's going to say, look, I'm really in charge, but, I'm busy, so I'm just going to let you run things. And if you run it well, I'll keep you in charge, and I'll pay you big amounts of money, and I'll give you all kinds of status and privilege, so just do a good job. And so that makes the vizier loyal to the sultan, loyal to the empire, so he does a good job because he wants to keep his position. So the vizier is really the guy making the day-to-day decisions of administering and running the state. Then we have our bureaucracy. Now, we have, it depends on the province, but in some provinces, just like the Seljuks and the Abbasids, you may have local people who are called emirs or governors who ruled. But also, we're going to see increasingly that the Ottomans were a tribal people that had tribal chieftains that Osman kind of grabbed together to say, okay, let's go out and conquer instead of fighting each other. And so these tribal chieftains, in order to get them on your side, let's say, look, I need this chief, let's say the Sultan says to some Ottoman Turk chieftain, he says, look, I want to go conquer. And so the chieftain says, well, you can have the warriors in my tribe as long as you give me something. And so we see that we work out a deal where the vizier and the sultan get the chieftains to go and give them their troops and go out and conquer a new territory. And in return, we're going to give you control of a province. And so we have this kind of complex system in the Ottoman Empire of sometimes local elites are governors. Sometimes we have what used to be the tribal leaders who are now governors, we call them nobles, who are in charge. And then sometimes we have these people called janissaries. So let's talk about these janissaries. Now, these janissaries are a lot like the Mamluks from the Abbasid Empire. The janissaries were taken captive as young boys, and sometimes they came from Christian areas of the former Byzantine Empire, or sometimes they're going to come from Muslim areas of Central Asia. But our armies go out, and the Sultan's armies conquer these villages, and they bring back every year more little boys that we're going to enslave. And now these little boys will then be brought up by the Sultan, and they'll be loyal to the Sultan because they forget their life. They were only 5 or so. They'll forget their previous life, and they will be loyal to the Sultan because he's going to feed them and house them and clothe them, just like what we talked about before in the previous empire. And these are going to come up to be his warriors, his loyal personal bodyguard, and they're called the janissaries. And he gives them all the latest weaponry, which in this case, in this time period, means gunpowder weapons. So that gives him a big advantage over other soldiers. And he says, look, I trust you because you guys look at me as your father, and they did to some extent because he's, raising them. And so they're his local bodyguard to guard against any, tribal leaders rebelling against him, or maybe the vizier turns disloyal or whatever. And so it's very useful for the Sultan to have these janissaries. So when the boys get captured, they converted to Islam, obviously, and then as they grow up, they are going to be put in one of 2 positions as a janissary. The boys who have a very scholarly aptitude, who seem to be able to catch on to reading and writing quickly, who are very good at math, those boys are going to be put in the Janissary Corps that is bureaucrats. These are going to be people that run government positions. They sometimes will rise to the status of governor, or sometimes they'll be just underneath the governor, and they'll help him collect taxes, and they'll keep an eye on him for the sultan. And so this is our bureaucracy, right? Bureaucracy means government workers. The other group of janissaries, maybe when the boys are little, maybe they're not so academic, maybe they're more athletic, and so they will be shepherded into the army. And so when you were taken as a captive, as a little boy by the Ottomans, from a rival area, you were put in this Janissary Corps, and then you were kind of sorted into either being bureaucrats or to being troops. In either case, you are very loyal to the Sultan, right? Because we've said that the Ottoman Empire is very complex. You have some governors who are tribal leaders who don't really want to do what the Sultan says. And you have some governors who are local elites who don't really want to do what the Sultan says. And so the Sultan is constantly trying to make more and more and more of the governors janissaries because they were raised by him, they get their position and status from him, and so he's trying to centralize. With centralization, we're going to talk a lot about that this year, but that means that the central government gets more and more and more powerful, and the local governments get weaker and weaker and weaker because it's all about getting more power from me if I'm the ruler. And so it's always this tug of war between centralization, the emperor or king or sultan having all the power, and decentralization, where you have the local nobility having all the power. And that's world history, right? It's this struggle between local and national power. All right, so what do the Ottomans do with people who are not Christian? They continue the long-standing practice of jizya. They continue to let Christians and Jews, the people of the book, the Damini as they're called, continue to practice their faith as long as they pay the religious tax. They also continue the practice of not letting Jews and Christians repair their synagogues or churches sometimes, and also not letting them go out and proselytize and convert new members. And so again, we see this continual kind of decrease of Jews and Christians in the Ottoman Empire. They're also going to continue the practice of encouraging trade. They're going to build a bigger navy to keep the maritime trade safe from pirates. They're going to maintain the caravanserai. They're going to maintain the safety of the roads because, again, empires like trade. You can tax it. It brings the empire wealth. So administration continued. So let's talk about a little bit more. And so it says build large-scale public works. A public works is something that the central government builds for the benefit, in theory, of all of society. Oftentimes, though, it ends up benefiting the central government. So let's give you some examples. And so one of the things that the Ottomans will build is they'll build these huge mosques, religious places where Muslims can go and pray, right? You have to pray 5 times a day, and wouldn't it be nice to pray in this amazing, beautiful mosque? And so they're gonna spend tons of tax money on these mosques, and that really helps the Sultan. It gives him legitimacy. If you're a Muslim in the Ottoman Empire, like, well, why should I follow what this Sultan says? Allah says we're all equal. I mean, it says we're all equal in his eyes. So why should I do what he say? Why can't we just all do what we want? And then the Sultan can come back and say, but I built this amazing mosque. I mean, look at it. It's just beautiful with these beautiful rugs to kneel on and all of this geometric patterns and Allah must really love me, and I must really be a promoter of him for giving you this place to pray in. And so it creates goodwill and legitimacy for the leader. Wow, let's be loyal to this leader because he gave us this amazing mosque. He also is going to continue the practice of madrasas, right? The Ottomans are going to create all kinds of free public schools where you can go and your son can learn how to read and to write. And of course, Muslims are supposed to be able to read the Quran in Arabic. But not only that, you can also become a merchant now or a skilled artisan or some kind of a tradesman because you can read and write. And all of this because the government gave you this free education. And so that makes you happy and support the government. So all of these public works projects, schools and mosques, are giving the government, like I said, leadership and support. So as the Ottomans continue on, we see what continued in the Seljuks and also the Abbasids. the Islamic world is a big world, and Muslims are supposed to take a Hajj, and so they're all supposed to come to Mecca, and they trade and interact. And as the Islamic empires continue to promote trade, we're going to see that we see a continuity of new ideas and math and science and cultural ideas and crops continue to trade back and forth and spread across the Islamic world. That's a continuity of the Islamic world at this time. And so we see some very famous poets. And so we can see her name here on the left. And so we see she is a Sufi, and she starts to talk about the mystical, wonderful connection she has with Allah and this beautiful poetry, and it starts to spread. And the reason we know about her is just as a great example of this idea of culture and art and architecture spreading around the Islamic world. So if you were to be living at this time, the Islamic world is one of the places you would want to be if you're intellectual and you like art and architecture and poetry and learning and knowledge. And so here we see this woman. It's an example of the spread of this culture at this time. And that finishes our lecture. And that is done with Islam and Islamic empires.